Okay, let's go. Number 1. The incense route. Close your eyes. Picture the ancient world. Scattered villages connected by dirt paths. Local farmers trading grain for pottery. Maybe a merchant traveling a day's journey to the next settlement. Everything small. Everything local. Everything isolated. Everything you just imagined is wrong. You're standing in Petra, 300 BCE 2000, 300 years ago. Carved sandstone cliffs tower about 130 feet above you, glowing red in the desert sun. Water flows through engineered conduits cut into rock. Treasury facades, temples, tombs all carved from living stone by people who got rich controlling a single resource. Frankincense and myrrh. These resins came from southern Arabia. Dhofar in modern Oman. The Hadramaut in Yemen. Scraped from Boswellia and Commiphora trees that grew nowhere else. The sap hardened into golden tears that burned with sweet smoke. And the entire Mediterranean world wanted it. Egyptian priests burned it in temples. Roman families burned it at funerals. Greek physicians prescribed it as medicine. It wasn't optional. It was essential to every major religion and ritual practice from the Nile to the Tiber. But here's what makes no sense. The trees grew 2,000 miles from the Mediterranean, in one of the harshest deserts on Earth. No rivers, no coastline suitable for shipping, no natural corridor. The Nabateans built an empire on that impossibility. They controlled Petra, the choke point where desert routes converged. Caravans arrived from the south carrying frankincense and myrrh. They paid taxes, bought water, rested, then continued to Gaza, Egypt, Damascus, and Mediterranean ports. The route operated for over 1,000 years. By 1000 BCE, 3,000 years ago, frankincense was already moving north. The trade peaked between 300 BCE and 100 CE, when Petra's population reached 20,000. Archaeologists trace pottery and incense residue along the route. They find Nabatean way stations every 20 to 30 miles. Each station had cisterns, corrals, fortifications. The infrastructure was permanent, organized, sophisticated. Mainstream archaeology explains this as natural economic development. Trade followed demand. Merchants found routes. Markets emerged. But that explanation skips the questions that matter. How did southern Arabian tribes coordinate with Nabatean middlemen 1,000 miles north? No shared language. No writing system in southern Arabia until centuries later. No centralized authority. How did they navigate? The desert has no landmarks. Sandstorms erase tracks. Summer temperatures reach 122 degrees Fahrenheit. One wrong turn means death. How did they secure water? Petra's water system required engineering knowledge calculating gradients, building aqueducts, maintaining cisterns across hundreds of miles. Who designed it? Who enforced maintenance? How did they enforce contracts? A caravan took months. Goods changed hands multiple times. What stopped theft? What guaranteed payment? This wasn't primitive barter. This was sophisticated long-distance trade operating at scale for over a millennium. The Nabateans didn't just move goods, they taxed them, stored them, protected them, controlled prices. They built a city in the desert that required constant imports. They carved monuments that took decades to complete, all before Rome became an empire, before Greece reached its classical period, before most of what you learned in history class even started, from Arabian incense to something even older. From the desert to the mountains of Afghanistan. Number 2. The lapis lazuli road. You're in Badakhshan, northeastern Afghanistan, 3000 BCE 5,000 years ago. Mountains rise around you, snow-capped peaks cutting into blue sky. You're holding a stone, deep blue, veined with gold pyrite that catches light like stars frozen in midnight. This stone will travel 2,500 miles to end up in a pharaoh's tomb. Lapis lazuli. It came from one place. These mountains, the Sarisang mines in Badakhshan, produce the finest quality lapis, the deepest blue, the richest gold flecking. And everyone wanted it. Sumerian kings were buried with it at Ar. Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s found lapis beads, cylinder seals, inlaid artwork in royal tombs dated to 2600 BCE 4,600 years ago. The standard of Ir used lapis for blue backgrounds. Egyptian pharaohs wore it. Tutankhamun's burial mask has lapis inlaid around the eyes and in the striped headdress. His tomb contained lapis scarabs, amulets, jewelry, dated to 1323 BCE 3,300 years ago. The Indus Valley cities traded it. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro produced lapis beads and seals. Workshops processed raw lapis imported from Afghanistan, dated to 2600 to 1900 BCE. But here's what breaks the timeline. Lapis appears at Mayogar, a Neolithic site in Pakistan, dated to 7000 BCE, 9000 years ago. Before cities, before writing, before metal. Stone Age farmers were already moving lapis from Afghan mountains 500 miles away. The distance from Badakhshan to Egypt is 2,500 miles. Mountains, deserts, rivers, the Hindu Kush, the Iranian plateau, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Syrian desert, the Sinai. No empire controlled that route. No roads connected the endpoints. No single language was spoken. Geological analysis proves the Afghan origin. Lapis has a unique mineral signature-specific ratios of lazurite, calcite, and pyrite that vary by source. Studies from the 1960s onward confirmed that lapis in Mesopotamian and Egyptian sites matches Badakhshan deposits. Not similar. Identical. The stone was mined in Afghanistan, transported across Central Asia, traded through multiple hands, and ended up in royal tombs from Sumer to Egypt. Mainstream archaeology explains this through gift exchange and tribute networks. Prestige goods moved between elites as diplomatic gifts. That explanation works for small quantities. A few beads. A cylinder seal. It doesn't explain the scale. The standard of ER required hundreds of lapis pieces. Tutankhamun's tomb contained pounds of it. Indus Valley workshops processed it in bulk. This wasn't occasional gift-giving. This was systematic trade operating for thousands of years. And we have no written records explaining how it worked. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia dates to 3200 BCE, 5200 years ago. By then, lapis had been moving for nearly 4,000 years. Whatever system transported it operated before anyone wrote down how trade worked, who carried it. Nomadic tribes, specialized traders, a relay system where stone passed from group to group. How many hands did it pass through? Each transaction required agreement on value. What did Afghan miners receive in return? How did they know what Mesopotamian kings wanted? What happened when routes were disrupted? Wars, droughts, tribal conflicts could cut supply. Did cities stockpile lapis? Did trade resume after disruptions? The stone moved. For thousands of years, across distances that should have been impossible for people without maps, without writing, without states, from Central Asian mountains to the frozen Baltic, from blue stone to golden resin. Number 3. The Amber Road. You're on the Baltic coast, 1600 BCE, 3,600 years ago. Cold wind off the sea. Gray water stretches to the horizon. You're holding fossilized tree resin, warm in your hand despite the chill. Golden orange, translucent, glowing like trapped sunlight. This will end up in a Mycenaean Greek tomb 1,500 miles south. Amber formed millions of years ago when ancient forests covered northern Europe. Resin oozed from trees, hardened, fossilized. Ice Age glaciers ground it up and deposited it along coastlines. The Baltic Sea had the richest deposits. Storm waves washed it onto beaches, and Mediterranean elites wanted it. Heinrich Schliemann excavated shaft graves at Mycenae in the 1870s. Gold masks, bronze weapons, pottery. And amber. Hundreds of amber beads and graves dated to 1600 to 1500 BCE. The beads came from the Baltic. Geochemical analysis confirmed that Baltic amber has unique succinic acid content that acts as a fingerprint. The distance from the Baltic to Mycenae is 1,500 miles, through Central Europe, across the Alps or around them, down the Adriatic or overland through the Balkans. No roads, no maps, no empire controlling the route. The amber moved along river corridors, the Vistula in Poland, the Oder, the Elbe, south to the Danube, then branching toward the Adriatic or southeast toward Greece. Archaeologists find amber beads scattered along these routes in Bronze Age settlements, in burial mounds, in hoards. The trade continued for over 1,000 years. Mycenaean Greece collapsed around 1200 BCE, 3,200 years ago, but amber kept moving. Etruscan Italy imported it. Celtic tribes worked it into jewelry. By the Roman period, Pliny the Elder wrote about the amber trade in his Natural History. But here's what doesn't make sense. This trade connected barbarian Europe with civilized Mediterranean. The direction is backwards. The sophisticated South importing luxury goods from the primitive North. Except the North wasn't primitive. Bronze Age Central Europe had fortified settlements, metalworking centers, burial mounds for elites filled with imported goods, bronze from the Alps, gold from Transylvania, amber from the Baltic. These weren't simple villages. These were nodes in a continental trade system. The amber trade required coordination across dozens of tribal groups. Each controlled a segment. Each needed to allow passage, provide security, take their cut. No central authority enforced this. And yet, it worked. For over 1,000 years. Mainstream archaeology explains this as down-the-line exchange. Amber passed from group to group, each trading with neighbors. No single trader made the full journey. That explanation works for small-scale exchange. A few beads moving slowly south. It doesn't explain the volume. Mycenaean shaft graves contain hundreds of amber beads. Roman sources describe amber arriving in bulk. Pliny mentions amber statues, vessels, decoration. This wasn't trickle trade. This was systematic supply meeting consistent demand. How did Baltic collectors know what Mediterranean buyers wanted? Beads of specific sizes and shapes. Pendants carved in particular styles. Someone communicated preferences back up the chain. How did they agree on value? Amber had no intrinsic use in the Mediterranean pure luxury. What did northern tribes receive in return? Bronze tools, pottery, wine. What happened when routes were disrupted? Wars between tribes, floods changing river courses, migrations displacing populations. The amber moved, from the frozen Baltic to the warm Mediterranean, before Rome, before classical Greece, before written history in northern Europe. From luxury resin to the metal that built civilizations, from amber to tin. Number 4. The Bronze Age tin routes. Bronze is copper plus tin, roughly 90% copper, 10% tin. That ratio matters because tin makes bronze hard enough for weapons and tools. Pure copper is too soft. The Bronze Age was named after this alloy. Entire civilizations rose and fell based on access to it. Copper deposits are common. Tin deposits are rare. The major Bronze Age powers Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece all needed tin. None had local sources. They had to import it from distant regions. Cornwall in southwest Britain, the Iberian Peninsula, the Erzgebirge Mountains between Germany and Czech Republic, Central Asia, possibly Afghanistan or Uzbekistan. These sources are 1,500 to 3,000 miles from the major Bronze Age centers. The Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off Turkey in 1982, sank around 1300 BCE 3,300 years ago. The cargo included 10 tons of copper ingots and 1 ton of tin ingots. Isotope analysis suggests tin from multiple sources, some Central Asian, some possibly Cornish or Iberian. This single merchant ship carried enough tin to make bronze for thousands of weapons. The Cape Geladanya wreck, also off Turkey, dated to 1200 BCE 3,200 years ago, carried similar cargo. Copper and tin ingots, raw materials for bronze production. These weren't isolated voyages. This was systematic trade supplying industrial-scale bronze production. Mycenaean Greece imported tin. Linear B tablets from Pylos and Knossos record bronze inventories, weapons, tools. They don't record where the tin came from, but geological surveys confirm no significant tin deposits in Greece. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia controlled major copper sources, but needed tin imports. Hittite texts mention tin arriving from the east, possibly from Central Asian sources via overland routes. Egypt had copper from Sinai but no tin. New Kingdom texts record tin as tribute and trade goods. Tutankhamun's tomb contained bronze objects. The tin came from outside Egypt. This creates strategic dependency. You can't make bronze weapons without tin. You can't maintain a Bronze Age army without reliable tin supplies. Whoever controls tin sources or routes has leverage. The distances are staggering. Cornwall to Mycenae is 2,000 miles. Central Asia to Egypt is 3,000 miles. These routes crossed multiple climate zones, dozens of tribal territories, mountain ranges, deserts, seas. No Bronze Age empire controlled the entire route. The tin moved through intermediaries, each controlling a segment. And yet the supply was consistent enough to support industrial bronze production across the Mediterranean and Near East for over 1,000 years. How did they find these sources? Tin deposits are geologically rare and often in remote regions. Someone had to prospect, identify ore, establish mining, and communicate back to distant buyers. How did they maintain supply during disruptions? The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE 3,200 years ago disrupted Mediterranean trade networks. Mycenaean palaces fell. Hittite cities burned. Bronze production declined sharply. Some regions reverted to stone tools because they couldn't get tin. But the knowledge didn't disappear. When trade networks recovered, tin routes reopened. Iron eventually replaced bronze, but that took centuries. How did they coordinate prices across such distances? Tin was valuable, but not infinitely so. Too expensive and buyers would hoard. Too cheap and miners wouldn't extract it. The tin moved. From the edges of the known world to the centers of Bronze Age power. Before anyone mapped these routes. Before anyone wrote down the logistics. From strategic metals to volcanic glass. From tin to obsidian. Number 5. The obsidian networks. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It forms when lava cools so rapidly that crystals don't have time to form. The result is sharper than surgical steel. A fresh obsidian blade can have an edge just 3 nanometers thick. Modern scalpels are around 300 nanometers. Before metal, obsidian was the sharpest material available. It was used for cutting tools, scrapers, arrowheads, spear points, ritual objects. In some cultures, obsidian blades were used for surgery, bloodletting, sacrifice. The problem is the same as with tin. Sources are geologically limited. You need active or recently active volcanic regions. The major sources were in Anatolia, central Turkey, around Cappadocia. The Caucasus region between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea. Some sources in Armenia and Georgia. A few in the Aegean Islands. These sources supplied obsidian to Neolithic farming villages across the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia from around 10,000 BCE 12,000 years ago onward. Before pottery. Before writing. Before cities. Before states. Sadil-Huruk in central Anatolia, one of the earliest large settlements, was occupied from roughly 7,500 to 5,700 BCE 9,500 to 7,700 years ago. The site had obsidian tools in nearly every household. Some came from local sources 120 miles away. Some came from sources over 300 miles away. Archaeologists use obsidian sourcing. Each volcanic source has a unique chemical signature trace elements that act like a fingerprint. By analyzing composition, researchers identify which volcano it came from. This technique has mapped Neolithic trade networks across thousands of miles. Obsidian from Cappadocia has been found in sites across the Levant, modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. Sites 600 miles from the source. Obsidian from the Caucasus reached Mesopotamia. Obsidian from Aegean Islands reached mainland Greece and Crete. Jericho, one of the oldest continuously occupied cities, had obsidian tools dating to 9,000 BC 11,000 years ago. The nearest source was over 400 miles away in Anatolia. Tel Sabi Abiad in northern Syria, occupied around 6,800 to 6,200 BC 8,800 to 8,200 years ago, had obsidian from multiple Anatolian sources. The inhabitants weren't going to Anatolia themselves. They were receiving obsidian through intermediaries, through multi-step trade chains. This is before writing, before anyone recorded trade agreements or mapped routes. The exchange was based on memory, oral tradition, repeated contact. What did they trade in return? Obsidian is valuable but not edible. The people at the source needed food, textiles, pottery, shells, other raw materials. Archaeologists find marine shells from the Mediterranean and Red Sea in Anatolian sites hundreds of miles inland. The trade wasn't just material, it was also cultural. Ideas moved with the obsidian, farming techniques, pottery styles, architectural designs, religious symbols. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated to around 9,600 to 8,200 BC, 11,006. 100 to 10,200 years ago as one of the oldest known monumental structures. It predates agriculture in the region. The site has obsidian tools, but it's not near a major source. The obsidian was imported, which means the people building these massive stone circles were already connected to long-distance trade networks. How did they organize this? No states, no centralized authorities, no written contracts, just repeated interactions between communities, separated by hundreds of miles. Did certain villages specialize as middlemen? Did they control access to sources and charge a markup? What happened when sources were exhausted or access was blocked? Volcanic eruptions could bury sources. Conflicts could cut routes. Climate shifts could make paths impassable. The obsidian moved, for thousands of years, across distances that required trust, memory, and repeated contact between people who had no writing, no maps, no formal institutions. From volcanic glass to wine-driven ships. From obsidian to the monsoon route. Number 6. The Indian Ocean monsoon route. Egypt, Arabia, India, and East Africa. Picture standing on the Red Sea coast, 100 CE 1,900 years ago. Wind shifts. Sailors prepare to cross open ocean. They'll reach India in 6 weeks. They've done this for centuries. The Indian Ocean has predictable seasonal winds. From roughly April to September, the southwest monsoon blows from Africa toward India. From October to March, the northeast monsoon reverses, blowing from India back toward Africa and Arabia. If you know the pattern, you can sail across the Arabian Sea without fighting the wind. You leave when the wind is favorable, spend months at your destination, then sail back when it reverses. This wasn't discovered in the Roman period. It was known thousands of years earlier. Egyptian records mention trade expeditions to Punt as early as 2500 BCE 4,500 years ago during the 5th dynasty. Punt was likely along the Red Sea coast modern Eritrea, Djibouti, or northern Somalia. The Egyptians sailed south for incense, myrrh, ebony, ivory, gold, leopard skins, and live animals. But the monsoon route extended far beyond the Red Sea. By the late Bronze Age, there's evidence of contact between the Near East, Arabia, and the Indus Valley. Mesopotamian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE mention trade with Dilmun, Magan, and Meluhha, likely Bahrain, Oman, and the Indus region. Indus Valley seals have been found in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian cylinder seals in the Indus Valley. Carnelian beads from India reached Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian textiles and metals likely moved in the other direction. This required ships capable of crossing the Arabian Sea. It required knowledge of seasonal winds, currents, safe harbors. It required networks of merchants operating across multiple language groups and political systems. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek merchant's guide written around the 1st century CE, describes the monsoon trade in detail. It lists ports, goods, sailing times, wind patterns from Egypt to India and East Africa. But the Periplus is documenting a system that was already ancient. Roman Egypt imported massive quantities from the Indian Ocean. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, pearls, gemstones, ivory, tortoiseshell, silk, cotton textiles. Roman coins have been found in southern India in large hoards, evidence of sustained trade. Pliny the Elder complained in the 1st century CE that Rome was hemorrhaging gold and silver to pay for luxury imports. He estimated the empire was losing 100 million sesterces per year to Eastern trade. But the monsoon route wasn't just Roman. South Arabian Kingdom Saba, Himyar, Hadramaut controlled key ports and overland routes. They taxed the incense trade and maritime trade. They built fleets and maintained relationships with Indian merchants. The Swahili coast of East Africa was integrated into this network. Ports like Rapta, mentioned in the Periplus, traded ivory, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, and slaves. What made this possible? The monsoon winds were predictable, but the distances were enormous. Egypt to southern India is over 3,000 miles by sea. Ships had to carry supplies for weeks. They had to navigate without accurate maps or instruments. They had to survive storms, pirates, the risk of being blown off course. Did merchants make the entire journey, or operate in stages? Did Egyptian merchants sail to Arabia, sell to Arab middlemen, who then sailed to India? Or did some make the full crossing? The Periplus suggests both models existed. Some merchants operated regionally. Others made long-distance voyages. The system was flexible. What happened when political disruptions cut off parts of the route? Wars between Rome and Parthia could close overland routes, pushing more trade onto sea routes. Conflicts in Arabia could disrupt port access. Piracy could make waters too dangerous. The monsoon winds blew, year after year, century after century, connecting Egypt, Arabia, India, and East Africa long before anyone called it the Indian Ocean Trade Network. From seasonal winds to Central Asian jade. From the monsoon route to the Jade Road. Number 7. The Jade Road. You're in Khotan, Western China, 2000 BCE 4,000 years ago. Green-white stone, cool and smooth, harder than bronze. This isn't for tools. This is for talking to ancestors. Jade wasn't just decorative in early Chinese culture. It was ritual material, used for ceremonial objects, burial goods, symbols of authority. It represented purity, immortality, connection to the divine. But China didn't have high-quality jade deposits in its heartland. The best jade came from Central Asia, from the region around Khotan, in what is now Xinjiang, and from the Kunlun Mountains. Nephrite jade, the type prized in ancient China, was found in riverbeds and mountain sources thousands of miles from the Yellow River Valley. Archaeological evidence shows jade reaching Chinese Neolithic cultures as early as the Hongshan culture, around 4700 to 2900 BCE Psyches, 1700 to 4900 years ago. Jade objects in elite burials from this period. Chemical analysis shows some originated from Central Asian sources, not local deposits. The Lianzhu culture, which flourished around 3300 to 2300 BCE 5, 1300 to 4300 years ago, and the Yangtze River Delta produced elaborate jade carvings, ritual Kong tubes, discs, ceremonial axes. Some of this jade also came from distant sources. By the Shang dynasty, around 1600 to 1046 BCE 3600 to 3000 years ago, jade was fully integrated into elite Chinese culture. Royal tombs contained jade burial suits, jade weapons, jade ritual vessels. But who moved it? How was the trade organized? The route likely operated in stages. Jade was extracted in Central Asia, moved to oasis towns like Khotan, then carried eastward along the northern or southern edges of the Taklamakan Desert. From there, it crossed into the Gansu corridor, then into the Chinese heartland. This wasn't a single road. It was a network of paths, shifting with political conditions, water availability, security. Oasis towns served as trading hubs. Nomadic groups controlled key passes and demanded payment. Local rulers taxed the trade. The logistics were brutal. The Taklamakan Desert is one of the harshest environments on Earth. Summer temperatures exceed 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Water sources are scarce. Sandstorms can bury caravans. Winter cold is severe. Traders had to carry water and food for weeks. They had to navigate by landmarks, stars, memory. They had to avoid bandits and negotiate with local powers. What made jade worth this risk? Why not use local stone? The answer is cultural. Jade wasn't just valuable because it was rare. Chinese elites believed it had spiritual properties. It was harder than other stones, difficult to carve, which made finished objects more impressive. It had specific texture and translucency that couldn't be replicated. Demand was high, supply was limited. The trade was profitable enough to justify the risks. By the time the Silk Road became famous during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE to 200 CE, the jade trade was already ancient. The infrastructure, the oasis towns, the knowledge of desert routes, the relationships between Chinese merchants and Central Asian middlemen all existed before silk became the dominant commodity. The Silk Road might be better understood as an expansion of older trade routes, including the Jade Road. The paths were already there. The networks were already established. Silk just became the most famous product. Chinese texts from the Han period mention the western regions, the areas beyond the Gansu corridor. They describe oasis kingdoms, nomadic tribes, trade goods. Jade is mentioned frequently. So are horses, another critical import. The Han Dynasty sent military expeditions into Central Asia, partly to secure access to these trade routes. Control over the Gansu corridor and oasis towns meant control over the flow of jade, horses, and other goods. What happened when routes were blocked? When nomadic groups became hostile? When oases dried up? The archaeological record shows jade continued to flow into China for thousands of years, despite political upheavals, climate shifts, conflicts. The trade was resilient. When one route closed, another opened. This wasn't a fragile system. It was adaptive, built on repeated contact, shared knowledge, and economic incentives strong enough to overcome enormous logistical challenges. From Central Asian jade to Bronze Age networks. From the Jade Road to the Oxus-Indus-Mesopotamia network. Number 8. The Oxus-Indus-Mesopotamia network. You're in a Bronze Age city, 2200 BCE 4200 years ago. Could be Harappa. Could be Ar. Could be Ghana Teep. Carnelian beads, lapis lazuli, copper ingots, ivory combs. All three cities had the same goods, from three different civilizations. Between roughly 2501,500 and 500 BCE 4,500 to 3,500 years ago, a trade network linked the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex with the Indus Valley, the Iranian Plateau, and Mesopotamia. This network moved metals, semi-precious stones, seals, shells, textiles, and probably perishable goods we can't trace. The Bactria-Margiana region is in modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, northern Afghanistan, Tajikistan. It was a Bronze Age civilization that built fortified settlements, produced sophisticated metalwork, controlled key resources. They had access to tin, copper, lapis lazuli, turquoise, carnelian. They produced distinctive pottery and seals. They built monumental architecture. But they didn't exist in isolation. Indus Valley seals have been found in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian cylinder seals in the Indus region. Bactrian objects appear in both areas. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan reached all three regions. This wasn't random diffusion. It was organized trade. Mesopotamian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE mention distant lands. Dilmun, Magan, Meluhha. Dilmun is usually identified with Bahrain. Magan is likely Oman. Meluhha is probably the Indus Valley. These texts describe trade goods. Copper from Magan, carnelian and ivory from Meluhha, precious stones and metals from various sources. They mention merchants, ships, overland caravans. The trade wasn't just luxury goods. It included bulk commodities. Copper was essential for bronze production. Tin was even more critical. Mesopotamian states needed both and didn't have local supplies, so they imported. From the Iranian Plateau, from Central Asia, from the Arabian Peninsula, from the Indus Valley. The logistics were complex. Overland routes crossed deserts, mountains, hostile territories. Maritime routes required ships capable of crossing the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea. Goods moved through multiple intermediaries, but the system worked for centuries. The Indus Valley civilization was one of the largest urban cultures of the Bronze Age. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had populations in the tens of thousands. They had standardized weights and measures, sophisticated drainage systems, long-distance trade networks. The Bactria-Margiana region served as a hub. It connected northern routes leading toward the steppes, and eventually China with southern routes to the Indus and Mesopotamia. Ancient trade routes rewritten .txt Mesopotamian cities needed what these regions produced. Bactria-Margiana and Indus merchants profited from the exchange. As long as the incentives were strong enough, the network persisted. Around 1900 BCE 3,900 years ago, Indus Valley civilization began to decline. Cities were gradually abandoned. Writing disappeared. The urban system collapsed. The trade network fragmented. Mesopotamian texts stopped mentioning Meluhha. The flow of Indus goods to Mesopotamia dropped sharply. But the routes didn't disappear. They shifted. New intermediaries emerged. The Iranian plateau continued to connect east and west. Central Asian cities continued to trade. The network was resilient because it wasn't dependent on a single state or civilization. It was a web of relationships between multiple actors. When one node failed, others adapted. How did merchants from three different civilizations speaking different languages, using different writing systems, following different customs coordinate trade? How did they establish trust? A Mesopotamian merchant sending goods to the Indus Valley wouldn't see payment for months. What guaranteed the transaction? How did they communicate value? Lapis lazuli was precious in Mesopotamia. Was it equally valued in the Indus? If not, how did they negotiate exchange rates? What happened when one civilization collapsed? The Indus decline disrupted the network, but Mesopotamia continued to import from other sources. Trade adapted, from Bronze Age networks to ancient Egyptian expeditions, from the Oxus-Indus-Mesopotamia network to the Red Sea route. Number 9. The Red Sea route to Punt. You're standing on the Red Sea coast, 2450 BCE 4450 years ago. 5 ships, each about 75 feet long, built from Lebanese cedar. Crews of 200. Destination, Punt. The journey will take months. This isn't exploration. This is established trade. Egyptian records document expeditions to Punt from the 5th dynasty onward. The earliest confirmed expedition dates to around 2450 BCE, under Pharaoh Sahur, but references suggest even earlier contact. Punt was somewhere along the Red Sea coast, modern Eritrea, Djibouti, northern Somalia, possibly extending to Yemen. The exact location is debated, but the trade goods are clear: incense, myrrh and frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, leopard skins, live animals, baboons, panthers, giraffes, exotic woods, cosmetics. The most famous expedition was under Queen Hatshepsut, around 1470 BCE 1,470 years ago. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari has detailed reliefs showing the journey: ships loaded with goods, Punt villages on stilts, trees being transported in pots, the Puntites offering tribute. The reliefs show 5 ships returning with 31 live myrrh trees, gold, ivory, ebony, animal skins, live baboons, and other goods. The trees were planted in Egypt to attempt to establish local production and break dependence on imports. It didn't work. Frankincense and myrrh trees require specific climate and soil. They wouldn't grow in Egypt. The trade continued. But here's what makes this route remarkable. The Red Sea is difficult to navigate. Coral reefs. Unpredictable winds. No natural harbors along much of the coast. Summer heat is extreme. The Egyptians had to build ships capable of open water sailing, provision them for months, navigate without accurate maps. And they did this repeatedly. For over 1,000 years. Recent research adds another layer. In 2020, a study analyzed baboon mummies from ancient Egypt using isotope analysis. The baboons came from Punt. By comparing isotopes in the mummies with modern baboon populations, researchers narrowed Punt's location to Eritrea and eastern Ethiopia. This confirms the Egyptians were sailing at least 1,200 miles down the Red Sea, possibly farther if they continued along the Somali coast. The expeditions weren't annual. They were occasional every few years or decades, depending on need and political stability. But they were systematic. The Egyptians knew the route. They knew what to expect. They had established relationships with Punt's inhabitants. Egyptian texts describe Punt as God's land, a place of divine origin, source of sacred materials. The incense was essential for temple rituals. The exotic animals were symbols of royal power. The gold and ivory were wealth and prestige. But the trade wasn't one way. What did the Egyptians offer in return? The reliefs show Egyptian goods being presented to Punt: weapons, tools, jewelry, bread, beer, wine. Manufactured goods in exchange for raw materials, the classic pattern of corporifery trade. Except Punt wasn't a primitive periphery. The reliefs show substantial villages, organized leadership, people who knew how to negotiate with Egyptian officials. This was trade between organized societies, not exploitation of isolated tribes. How did the Egyptians maintain knowledge of the route across centuries? Expeditions were infrequent. Decades might pass between voyages. Yet each new expedition successfully reached Punt. This required institutional memory, written records, oral tradition, training for ship captains and navigators. Maintenance of shipbuilding knowledge. Red Sea ships were different from Nile River boats. What happened when expeditions failed? Ships lost to storms. Crews dying from disease or thirst. Hostile encounters. The reliefs show successful voyages. They don't show the failures, but failures must have occurred. The Red Sea is unforgiving. Yet the trade continued. The incentives were strong enough. The rewards valuable enough. The ideological importance significant enough. From Egyptian expeditions to older corridors. From the Red Sea route to the precursors of the Persian Royal Road. Number 10. The Royal Road's older precursors. The Persian Royal Road ran about 1,550 miles from Susa to Sardis. Rest stations every about 16 miles. Royal messengers covering the distance in 7 days. Herodotus marveled at it. That line about neither snow nor rain became the U.S. Postal Service motto. But the road wasn't new. It followed routes that had connected Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and Iran for thousands of years. The old Assyrian trading colony at Kanesh, central Anatolia, operated around 1950 to 1750 to 1750. BCE 3750 to 3750 years ago. Cuneiform tablets document tin and textile trade. Assyrian merchants from northern Mesopotamia established permanent posts. They imported tin from the east, textiles from Assyria, exported silver and gold. This was private enterprise, merchant families, partnerships, credit systems, long-distance contracts. The state taxed it, but didn't control it. The routes these merchants used were older. Bronze Age networks connected Mesopotamia to Anatolia from 3000 BCE 5000 years ago onward. Mesopotamia needed metals. Anatolia had copper, silver, iron. Trade routes formed. The same pattern extended east. Elam in southwestern Iran traded with Mesopotamia for millennia. The Zagros Mountains were difficult narrow passes, steep terrain, bandits. But Mesopotamian states needed Iranian copper and tin. Iranian elites wanted Mesopotamian textiles and grain. Horses moved along these routes. The Iranian plateau and Central Asia were major sources. Horses were expensive, prestigious, militarily essential. Controlling horse trade meant controlling power. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, first millennium BCE, formalized parts of this network. They built roads, bridges, way stations. They established a postal system. The Persians inherited this infrastructure, expanded it, standardized it. But the royal road was the culmination of thousands of years of development. Each empire built on its predecessors. Each generation of merchants refined routes, improved logistics, accumulated knowledge. These 10 routes from Arabian incense to the royal road's precursors show how deeply connected the ancient world was. Long before the Silk Road, long before Rome and Han China, long before the medieval networks that dominate history classes. The connections were there. The trade was there. The networks were there. We just forgot to look. You made it here. That means you're the kind of person who questions the simple stories. Who wants to know how things actually worked. Who sees the ancient world not as isolated villages, but as connected systems operating at scales that shouldn't have been possible. Subscribe if this changed how you see history. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from?